The first light of dawn on the 22nd of June 1941 should have been just another summer morning in the quiet border town of Brest. Instead, it became a curtain of fire. Without warning, the thunder of artillery shattered the silence as German guns unleashed a devastating barrage. Walls shook, barracks crumbled, and the ancient stones of the Brest Fortress trembled under a storm of steel. Inside, Soviet soldiers awoke to chaos. Some were still in their bunks, others rushed half-dressed into the courtyards, blinded by smoke and dust, clutching rifles as the ground erupted beneath them. For many of these men, the war had not officially begun just moments earlier. In a single instant, their world shifted from uneasy peace to sheer survival. Entire families, wives and children of officers were trapped inside the fortress, huddling in cellars as explosions echoed above. The fortress that once symbolized strength and security was now a blazing cage, encircled by an enemy determined to crush it. The German army had calculated that Brest would fall in a matter of hours. Overwhelming firepower, precision planning, and the element of surprise were all on their side. Yet, within those smouldering walls, Soviet defenders made a fateful choice. They would not surrender easily. Even cut off, outnumbered, and facing certain death, they clung to their posts with a desperate determination. What compelled these soldiers, ordinary men, ill-prepared for such a storm, to resist against all odds? And why did the fortress of Brest, expected to collapse in a single morning, instead become the scene of one of the most haunting stands of the Second World War? By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler's Germany had already swept through much of Europe. Poland had fallen, France had capitulated in a matter of weeks, and the Balkans were under Axis control. Only Britain still stood defiant, but the war in the West had reached a stalemate. For Hitler, the future lay in the East. His eyes were fixed on the vast lands of the Soviet Union territory he coveted for its resources, its fertile soil, and the ideological war against communism he long proclaimed. On the 22nd of June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began the largest invasion in the history of warfare. 3 massive German army groups rolled across a front, stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers. Their objectives were ambitious: capture Leningrad in the north, drive toward Moscow in the center, and seize the rich farmlands of Ukraine in the south. It was a war of annihilation, one designed not merely to defeat the Red Army, but to erase the Soviet state itself. At the western border of the Soviet Union, where the Bug River cut through the landscape, stood the Brest Fortress. Built in the 19th century by the Russian Empire, the fortress had been modernized over decades and was a formidable structure of thick walls, bastions, and underground passages. Strategically, it guarded a vital crossing into the heart of Belarus, directly on the path of the German Army Group Center. Whoever controlled Brest would control a gateway into Soviet territory. Inside the fortress were units of the Red Army's 6th and 42nd Rifle Divisions, elements of border guards, and a small number of artillery troops. The garrison was not enormous, only several thousand soldiers, but it was far from empty. Complicating matters further, many of the soldiers were accompanied by their families. Wives, children, and civilians lived within the fortress complex, believing that, despite rising tensions, their lives remained safe behind the fortress walls. The defenders had little warning. Stalin's government, despite numerous intelligence reports, had refused to believe Hitler would break the non-aggression pact so soon. As a result, the fortress had no special defensive preparations in place. Ammunition was stored but not distributed, weapons were stacked in depots rather than kept at the ready, and many officers were still asleep when the first shells fell. In contrast, the Germans had meticulously prepared. Their plan was to overwhelm Brest within hours, eliminating any resistance and pushing deep into Soviet territory without delay. The balance of forces could not have been more unequal. The German 45th Infantry Division, supported by heavy artillery and air bombardments, was tasked with reducing Brest. They brought siege guns, mortars, and the advantage of complete surprise. The Soviets, scattered across different sectors of the fortress, were cut off from higher command almost immediately. Telephone lines were severed, and radio contact was lost as German shells rained down. Within minutes, the fortress was an isolated island of resistance surrounded by enemy forces. What made the situation even more desperate was the psychological shock. For most Soviet soldiers, the The war began not on a distant battlefield but in their own barracks, with their families trapped beside them. The chaos of that first morning, children crying in cellars, soldiers rushing half-armed into smoke-filled courtyards, set the tone for a defense that would be marked not only by military struggle, but by raw human endurance. Brest Fortress was never intended to withstand a prolonged siege in 1941. It was a border outpost, a stronghold that symbolized presence rather than an impregnable bastion. Yet, within its crumbling walls, ordinary men and women would transform it into a symbol of defiance. What unfolded in the days ahead was not a conventional battle between two armies, but a story of survival, loyalty, and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming force. In the chaos of war, battles are often reduced to numbers, divisions, brigades, casualties. Yet within the walls of Brest Fortress, the story was shaped by individuals, each carrying their own burdens of duty, fear, and conviction. To understand the drama that would unfold, we must first meet those who stood on either side of its battered gates. On the Soviet side, the garrison was a patchwork of units. Elements of the 6th and 42nd Rifle Divisions formed the bulk of the defenders. These were regular infantrymen, young, poorly prepared for a sudden onslaught, but loyal to their posts. Border guards, trained to patrol the frontier rather than fight pitched battles, added to their ranks. Scattered among them were small artillery detachments, operating guns that would soon be silenced by superior German firepower. At the head of the defense were officers such as Major Pyotr Gavrilov, commander of the 44th Rifle Regiment, and Commissar Yefim Fomin, a political officer of the 84th Rifle Regiment. Gavrilov was a career soldier, pragmatic and steady, whose calm presence inspired those around him. Fomin, on the other hand, embodied the ideological resolve of the Soviet system, unyielding in his insistence that surrender was not an option. There were also countless unnamed lieutenants and sergeants who, when higher command collapsed, took responsibility for holding fragments of the fortress together. Among the defenders were not only soldiers but families. Officers' wives and children lived in the fortress complex. When the first shells fell, many rushed into basements, clutching infants as the world above shook apart. Their presence added a tragic dimension to the defense. Soldiers were not only fighting for their country but for the loved ones trapped just a few meters away. On the German side, the task of capturing Brest fell to the 45th Infantry Division of Army Group Center, commanded by Major General Fritz Schlieper. The division had been forged in earlier campaigns in Poland and France, disciplined and confident. Supporting them were engineers and heavy artillery units armed with siege guns, including 210mm howitzers capable of smashing through stone fortifications. Luftwaffe squadrons circled above, dropping bombs with ruthless efficiency. The Germans possessed every advantage in planning, coordination, and firepower. Their commanders believed the fortress would fall within hours, another stepping stone on their march toward Moscow. For the average German infantryman, Brest was meant to be a brief assignment, not the site of prolonged resistance. What neither side fully anticipated was the role of morale. The Germans entered with confidence but little emotional investment. Brest was just another target on a vast map. The Soviets, however, were cornered in their homes, with their families and comrades beside them. This imbalance of desperation would prove critical. In the days that followed, names like Gavrilov and Fomin would echo through the fortress as symbols of resistance. Yet for every commander remembered, there were countless ordinary soldiers, Sergei, Ivan, Mikhail, whose stories were never recorded. Some would hold a single position until their last bullet. Others would crawl through smoke-filled corridors to rescue children. Their courage would outlast their anonymity, woven into the legend of Brest. Thus, the cast of this battle was set. On one side, a disciplined German division armed with overwhelming force. On the other, a scattered Soviet garrison, half-prepared but bound by desperation and duty. Between them stood the ancient walls of Brest Fortress, about to become both tomb and testament. The Brest Fortress, on the eve of the 22nd of June 1941, was not a battlefield, it was a garrison at rest. The soldiers within its walls went about their routines, unaware that they were perched on the edge of catastrophe. The summer air was warm, the courtyards quiet, and many officers spent the evening with their families. A sense of uneasy peace lingered, but few imagined how quickly it would shatter. For weeks, rumors had spread through the ranks. German forces were massing along the frontier, their movements too obvious to ignore. Border guards reported unusual activity across the Bug River, columns of vehicles, flashes of light from artillery positions at night. Yet, from Moscow, the orders remained clear: do not provoke the Germans. Stalin clung to the belief that Hitler would not break the non-aggression pact, at least not yet. Any defensive preparations risked being interpreted as aggression, and so the garrison remained in a state of deceptive calm. Inside the fortress, life carried on. Soldiers drilled, cleaned weapons, and tended to the mundane tasks of barracks life. In the evenings, some gathered to play chess or write letters home. Wives cooked meals in shared kitchens, children played in the courtyards, their laughter echoing against the old stone walls. The fortress seemed like a community as much as a military stronghold, a place where daily life unfolded under the shadow of distant tension. A few officers harbored private doubts. Major Pyotr Gavrilov reportedly sensed the danger and quietly urged his men to remain alert, though he had no authority to issue broader defensive measures. Commissar Yefim Fomin, ever vigilant, lectured soldiers on their duty, reminding them that if war came, they were to resist with unwavering resolve. But neither could overcome the inertia of a system that refused to acknowledge the storm on the horizon. Meanwhile, across the river, the German 45th Infantry Division prepared with meticulous precision. For days, they had moved into position under strict secrecy, camouflaging artillery and assembling ammunition. Engineers studied maps of the fortress, identifying weak points in its defences. Their orders were explicit: Brest must be taken swiftly, with overwhelming force, to clear the path for Army Group Center's advance toward Minsk and Smolensk. To the German High Command, the fortress was an obstacle, nothing more a relic of a bygone era that could not withstand the modern might of blitzkrieg. The contrast could not have been greater. Inside, the defenders lulled into complacency. Outside, the attackers poised with grim efficiency. As night fell on June 21, the soldiers of Brest retired to their bunks, the stillness of sleep masking the fact that thousands of German guns were already trained on their walls. In the silence before dawn, fate held its breath. When the first shells came, they would come without warning, turning routine into nightmare. The preparation was over. The fortress would awaken to fire. At 3:15 a.m., on the 22nd of June 1941, the night sky above Brest Fortress erupted. Without declaration, without warning, the German artillery opened fire. The bombardment was sudden and overwhelming. Massive shells slammed into the fortress walls, shaking the earth, sending masonry and timber flying through the air. Windows shattered, barracks collapsed, and entire sections of buildings were reduced to rubble in seconds. Soldiers jolted awake in darkness, choking on dust and smoke, unable to comprehend what was happening. The German plan relied on shock. For half an hour, their guns pounded the fortress relentlessly, targeting every known position. Heavy mortars and 210mm siege howitzers unleashed their fury, while the Luftwaffe screamed overhead, dropping bombs into courtyards and cellars. Flames consumed wooden structures, and the air filled with screams of the wounded. The fortress, so still hours earlier, now resembled an inferno. Inside, chaos reigned. Many soldiers were cut off from their units. Officers were killed in their sleep, leaving survivors to fight leaderless. Ammunition depots were destroyed, leaving defenders scrambling for weapons. Families sought refuge in basements, clutching children as the walls shook with each detonation. Panic threatened to consume the defenders, but amid the terror, discipline slowly asserted itself. Major Gavrilov gathered remnants of his regiment in the eastern fortification, shouting orders above the roar of battle. Commissar Fomin rallied men in the barracks near the river gate, reminding them of their duty to resist. Border guards, accustomed to small skirmishes, now found themselves manning heavy machine guns against an enemy they could barely see through the smoke. Even scattered and disoriented, the defenders began to return fire. For the Germans, the assault seemed to go as expected. By mid-morning, infantry units moved across the Bug River, supported by tanks and engineers. Their orders were clear: seize the fortress swiftly, mop up resistance, and continue the advance eastward. As they entered the outer grounds, they found smouldering ruins and shattered walls. But the expectation of easy victory quickly faltered. From windows, from courtyards, from the jagged holes blasted into walls, Soviet fire erupted. Machine guns rattled, rifles cracked, grenades arced through smoke. German soldiers fell in the very shadow of the fortress gates. The defenders fought in small, isolated groups. With communications destroyed, coordination was nearly impossible. Each pocket of resistance acted independently, yet with remarkable tenacity. A platoon might hold a staircase, another a bridge, another a courtyard. In some sectors, soldiers fought from basements, emerging only to fire before retreating underground. In others, they clung to positions until ammunition ran dry, then resorted to bayonets and hand-to-hand combat. By afternoon, the Germans realized Brest was not yielding. Engineers attempted to breach walls with explosives, but each opening became a deadly choke point where Soviet defenders ambushed attackers at close range. Civilians trapped in cellars added to the confusion, some helping soldiers reload weapons, others tending to the wounded, all the while enduring the same horrors. One harrowing account describes a Soviet machine gun crew continuing to fire long after their position was surrounded. When the Germans finally silenced the nest, they found the crew dead, still at their post. Such defiance shocked the attackers, who had anticipated panic and surrender. Instead, they encountered a stubborn defense that defied both logic and their own expectations. As darkness fell on that first day, the fortress remained in Soviet hands, though in ruins. Fires burned unchecked, the air heavy with smoke and the stench of blood. The defenders were battered, cut off, and dwindling in number. But their will had not broken. The Germans, frustrated, withdrew to regroup, confident that renewed bombardment would finish the job by morning. Yet inside Brest, a grim resolve took hold. Soldiers whispered vows to fight to the end. Commissar Fomin declared there would be no surrender, and Major Gavrilov, exhausted but unbowed, told his men that the fortress itself would be their comrade. They would hold every stone until none remained. The battle for Brest Fortress had begun not as a swift conquest but as a siege. What was meant to last hours would drag into days, and as the sun rose again, both sides understood that the struggle ahead would be far more costly than anyone had imagined. The second morning of the siege dawned with renewed thunder. Once again, German artillery and bombers rained destruction on the fortress. This time, the bombardment targeted specific strongpoints that had resisted the day before. The eastern fortification, where Major Gavrilov's men still held out, the barracks near the river gate defended by Commissar Fomin, and the central courtyard where isolated platoons had entrenched themselves. The earth shook continuously. The defenders, sleepless and hungry, crouched in ruins that had once been barracks and command posts. German engineers advanced behind the barrage, planting explosives to collapse walls and clear passageways. When breaches opened, infantry stormed in, only to be met with a hail of Soviet fire. The pattern repeated itself again and again: breach, assault, repulse, and slaughter in the rubble. What should have been easy gains for the attackers turned into grinding, close-quarters combat. Inside the fortress, conditions grew desperate. Food was scarce, and water scarcer still. The Bug River flowed just outside the fortress walls, but under constant German fire, it was nearly impossible to reach. Thirst drove men to risk their lives. Some crept out at night with canteens, few returned. Others resorted to drinking from stagnant pools or damp cellars, water fouled by dust and blood. Hunger gnawed at their strength, but determination kept them on their feet. On the third day, the Germans escalated further. They deployed flamethrowers into breached tunnels and cellars, spewing fire that turned stone chambers into ovens. Defenders died screaming, while survivors emerged half-burned, only to fight on with whatever weapons they could grab. Civilians, too, suffered this horror. Mothers shielding children from fire and smoke, families huddling in corners praying for an end that never came. Yet even in such inferno, pockets of defiance flared. In one courtyard, a group of Soviet soldiers ambushed German infantry with grenades, scattering the attackers and forcing them to retreat. In another sector, a machine gun crew held a collapsed stairwell for hours, mowing down wave after wave until the last man fell. Commissar Fomin moved tirelessly from one barricade to another, exhorting men to endure, repeating the mantra, "Not one step back." His presence, a mixture of political fervor and raw courage, became the glue holding fragments of resistance together. Major Gavrilov's stand in the eastern fortification became legendary. Even as his men dwindled, he organized every available weapon, machine guns, rifles, even captured German arms to repel assaults. For days, his stronghold blazed with gunfire, earning the respect and frustration of German commanders. Reports described the defenders as fanatics who refused to yield, no matter the odds. To Gavrilov and his men, they were not fanatics but soldiers clinging to honor, fighting for their comrades, their families, and the fortress itself. By the fourth day, the fortress was a carcass of stone and ash. Smoke curled from blackened ruins, bodies lay unburied in courtyards, and the stench of decay spread through tunnels. Ammunition was nearly gone. Many defenders had only a handful of bullets left, others none at all. Still, they fought with bayonets, knives, even bricks torn from walls. Each position, once overwhelmed, revealed not surrender but corpses beside empty cartridge boxes. The Germans, stunned by the persistence of resistance, grew increasingly brutal. Prisoners were executed on the spot, civilians were driven from hiding places, and heavy weapons pulverized any structure still standing. Yet the psychological impact of Soviet defiance could not be erased. Brest Fortress, which should have fallen in hours, had tied down an entire division for days, delaying its advance and humiliating its commanders. In one of the siege's most haunting episodes, German troops reported hearing Soviet voices singing from underground chambers. Even as flamethrowers seared tunnels and explosives collapsed vaults, the defenders sang patriotic songs, their voices echoing through smoke-filled corridors until silence finally fell. Such scenes etched themselves into the memories of both sides, transforming the battle from a military engagement into a legend. The turning point came not in a single moment but in the gradual erosion of the defenders' strength. By the end of the fourth day, organized resistance was shattered into isolated groups. Commissar Fomin was captured, executed soon after for being both a Jew and a communist commissar, an unforgivable enemy in Nazi ideology. Major Gavrilov, though wounded and unconscious when finally taken prisoner, survived, his defiance immortalized long after. What remained inside Brest were scattered men fighting alone or in tiny bands, refusing to lay down arms. Some continued for another week, haunting the fortress ruins, emerging at night to strike German patrols. Graffiti scratched into the walls bore witness to their final thoughts. "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, motherland." These words, carved in desperation, ensured their voices would outlive their bodies. Thus, the climax of the battle was reached not with a decisive blow, but with the gradual extinguishing of resistance. Yet the turning point was paradoxical. Though the fortress fell, its defenders had already achieved something greater. By enduring beyond all expectation, they transformed Brest from a military obstacle into a symbol of courage that would echo across the Soviet Union. By the end of June's first week, the fortress of Brest no longer resembled a defensive stronghold. Its walls were shattered, its barracks burned, its courtyards littered with corpses and twisted metal. The German 45th Infantry Division finally reported the position secured, though the word secured felt hollow. What was supposed to be a lightning victory had dragged into a bitter struggle that consumed precious time and resources. The cost was heavy on both sides. For the Soviets, the fortress was reduced to silence, its defenders either killed, captured, or scattered. Of the thousands who had begun the defense, only a fraction remained alive, many of them gravely wounded. Major Gavrilov, unconscious and covered in blood, was taken prisoner, but his survival meant that at least one living witness would carry the story forward. Commissar Fomin, executed soon after capture, became a martyr. Countless others were never identified, their names lost in rubble. For the Germans, victory came not with triumph, but with frustration. Hundreds of their soldiers had been killed or wounded in what should have been a minor operation. Brest had delayed the advance of Army Group Centre by days, a costly inconvenience in a campaign where speed was everything. Commanders were forced to explain why a single fortress, supposedly obsolete, had resisted so fiercely. The psychological outcome was even more striking. For the Soviet Union, news of Brest's defense spread by survivors and confirmed by enemy reports quickly became a rallying cry. In the darkest days of 1941, when the Red Army reeled under relentless German offensives, the story of men who had held out in Brest offered proof that resistance was possible, even in hopeless circumstances. The fortress did not surrender became both a phrase and a legend. For the Germans, Brest was a foretaste of the war they had entered, a war not of easy victories but of bitter resistance, where even surrounded, outnumbered soldiers could tie down an entire division. It was an omen of the grinding conflict to come on the Eastern Front. Thus, the immediate outcome was paradoxical. The fortress fell, but the defenders prevailed in spirit. Their defiance would outlast the ruins, haunting both victors and vanquished. The battle for Brest Fortress ended in ruins and silence, but its echoes reverberated far beyond the smouldering walls. What began as a local clash on the frontier became a legend that shaped morale, propaganda, and memory throughout the course of the Second World War. In the immediate sense, the fortress was lost. German control of Brest opened a gateway into Belarus, enabling Army Group Center to push deeper toward Minsk, Smolensk, and ultimately Moscow. The Red Army, caught unprepared along much of the frontier, suffered catastrophic defeats in the weeks that followed. In sheer strategic terms, the fall of Brest was one small part of a disaster that engulfed the Western Soviet Union. The defenders' sacrifice could not alter the massive imbalance between the Wehrmacht and Soviet border forces in June 1941, yet the cost to the Germans was significant. The 45th Infantry Division had been tied down for nearly a week, losing hundreds of men in an operation expected to last mere hours. In the calculus of blitzkrieg, where speed and momentum were paramount, such delays mattered. Brest became a symbol of resistance that defied the German assumption that Soviet morale would collapse at the first blow. For those who survived, the aftermath was marked by suffering. Captured defenders were marched into captivity. Many executed outright. Commissar Yefim Fomin's fate was especially brutal. As both a commissar and a Jew, he was singled out and shot immediately. Others perished in prisoner of war camps, victims of starvation and neglect in a system that claimed millions of Soviet captives. Families caught in the fortress endured tragedy, wives widowed, children orphaned, entire households erased in the rubble. Yet amid this devastation, the seeds of legend began to grow. Even German soldiers, hardened by campaigns in Poland and France, spoke with grudging respect of the Soviet defense. They described opponents who fought until the last bullet, who resisted even when cut off, starved, and hopelessly outnumbered. Reports of graffiti carved into fortress walls, "I am dying, but I will not surrender," spread like whispers across both sides of the front. As the war dragged on and the Soviet Union endured further catastrophes, stories of Brest were elevated by Soviet propaganda into a symbol of unbreakable spirit. In newspapers, on the radio, and later in wartime films, the fortress was depicted as the first great stand of the Red Army against the fascist invader. The reality of scattered, chaotic resistance became a narrative of unified heroism. While embellished in places, the core truth remained undeniable. Men and women at Brest fought with extraordinary courage in circumstances that defied survival. The legend served a crucial purpose. In the dark months of 1941, when German forces threatened Moscow and Leningrad, Soviet citizens needed reminders that resistance was possible. Brest provided such a reminder. Its defenders had shown that even in hopeless situations, Soviet soldiers could inflict pain on the enemy and inspire others to stand firm. In the long term, Brest Fortress became enshrined in Soviet memory. After the war, survivors like Major Pyotr Gavrilov recounted their experiences, ensuring that personal testimony anchored the legend in lived reality. Gavrilov, who endured years as a prisoner of war, emerged as one of the central figures in post-war commemorations. Monuments were erected at the site, transforming the ruins into a place of pilgrimage. In 1965, Brest Fortress was awarded the title Hero Fortress, one of only a handful of such honors bestowed by the Soviet state. The fortress thus entered the pantheon of Soviet mythology alongside battles like Stalingrad and Sevastopol. Its ruins, preserved rather than rebuilt, became a living reminder of sacrifice. Generations of schoolchildren were brought to its gates, taught to revere the courage of those who had fallen. To Soviet citizens, Brest symbolized not defeat but the will to resist, even in the face of overwhelming odds. For historians, the battle highlighted both the weakness and resilience of the Soviet military in 1941. On the one hand, the garrison was ill-prepared, poorly equipped, and caught off guard by the German assault. On the other, their refusal to surrender challenged the Nazi assumption that communism bred cowardice. The defense foreshadowed the grim, grinding nature of the war on the Eastern Front, where ideological hatred and human determination would produce some of the most brutal fighting in history. For Germany, Brest was both victory and warning. Yes, the fortress fell, but not easily. The Wehrmacht learned that Soviet defenders, even when surrounded and leaderless, could fight with astonishing ferocity. The myth of the Red Army's collapse was shaken, and as the campaign pushed eastward, Germans would encounter countless other examples of resistance just as stubborn, if not as dramatic. The aftermath of Brest also raises questions of memory and myth. Soviet propaganda elevated the fortress into a near-mythical stand, smoothing over its chaos and despair to present a unified narrative of defiance. In reality, the defense was fragmented, communications broken, leadership improvised. Soldiers fought not as part of a grand plan, but out of instinct, loyalty, and desperation. Yet perhaps it was precisely this raw, human struggle that made the story resonate. It was not perfection but persistence, not triumph but endurance, that defined Brest. Even today, the ruins of the fortress stand as silent witnesses. Visitors walk through shattered walls, see bullet-scarred bricks, and read the inscriptions left behind. "I am dying, but I will not surrender." The words remain carved into stone, defying time, reminding all who pass that heroism is often born not of victory, but of refusal to yield. In the grand scale of Operation Barbarossa, Brest was a small battle. It did not alter the trajectory of the invasion, nor did it prevent the catastrophe that befell the Red Army in 1941. But in memory and meaning, it became far larger than its tactical significance. Brest was the spark at the dawn of the Soviet-German War, a spark that burned long after the guns fell silent. The ruins of Brest Fortress still stand on the banks of the Bug River, their scarred walls and shattered arches preserved as monuments to defiance. Walk through its gates today, and the silence is heavy. Bullet holes pockmark the stone, memorials rise where barracks once stood, and the echoes of that June morning linger in every courtyard. It is a place where the past feels alive, where one can almost hear the thunder of artillery and the shouts of men who refused to yield. For the soldiers who defended Brest in June 1941, there was no promise of victory, no hope of relief. They fought not because they believed they could win, but because surrender was unthinkable. In their final hours, they carved words into the fortress walls. "I am dying, but I will not surrender." Those words outlived the men who wrote them. They became the essence of Brest, a message carried forward through generations. History often remembers the great turning points: Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin. Yet the story of Brest reminds us that heroism does not require grand battles or decisive outcomes. Sometimes it emerges in isolation, in hopeless defense, in the courage to endure even when the end is certain. Brest was such a place, a tragedy and a triumph entwined. As dawn broke on the 22nd of June 1941, the fortress was caught in the firestorm of a war that would consume millions. But in its last days, Brest showed that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit can stand unbroken. And so the fortress endures, not as a relic of stone, but as a symbol of defiance.